Dad, why is Uncle Grant on Mom's letter?
What letter, Wyatt? Bring it to the table.
The one from the insurance. It came today. Your name isn't on it. His is.
Read me the line under his name. Slow, so I hear it right.
It says he's the beneficiary, and that Mom signed for it in April.
Your mother signed this in April.
That's what the paper says.
Wyatt, in April your mom couldn't hold a spoon. You fed her the ice chips yourself.
I know. Her hands were too cold. So how did she sign her name, Dad?
Caleb Dorsey did not answer his son right away, because a man who works bees learns not to move fast when something is wrong in the box. He was 41, and he kept 16 hives outside Ambrose, Kentucky, and sold what they made at the Saturday market. The town had long ago decided he was a simple man, quiet and slow to speak, and he never corrected them, because a beekeeper knows the loudest thing in the field usually understands the least about what is happening in the hive. He took the letter from his son's hand and read it twice. Ashford Mutual Life. A policy on the life of Hannah Marie Dorsey, $500,000 paid out 14 months earlier. And on the line where his own name should have sat, where it had sat for 11 years, was another name entirely. She ran the market stand and did the books, and knew every customer's children by name, and she had painted a name onto the side of every one of Caleb's 16 hives in her own looping hand, small and careful, so that the field read like a row of houses on a street. She was diagnosed with cancer in the winter, and she declined all through that spring, and by March her hands had stopped working, the fine control gone first, so that she could not hold a brush or a pen or a spoon, and their 10-year-old son had learned to feed her chips of ice off a plastic spoon because her fingers were too cold and too weak to hold anything at all. She died in May. She was 38. Grant Merrow gave the eulogy. Grant had been Caleb's best friend since they were 7 years old, since a schoolyard in this same town where Grant, even then, had been the one who could talk, the one teachers liked, the one who always seemed to be standing in the warm part of the room. He grew up to sell insurance and manage money, and he did it with a big laugh and a firm handshake and a way of making the frightening parts of adult life feel handled. He coached the Little League team. He read scripture at the Wednesday service. He had sold Caleb and Hannah their life policies 11 years ago at their own kitchen table, and when Hannah got sick, he was there every week at first, bringing casseroles and paperwork in that big steady voice, telling Caleb to focus on his wife and his boy and let him carry the rest. And at the funeral, in front of the whole town, Grant Merrow had stood at the pulpit and wept and told of them all how Hannah, in her final days, had taken his hand and asked him, as her oldest friend, to look after everything, to make sure her boy was taken care of. He said she had trusted him with her last wishes because she knew Caleb, God love him, was a man of the field and not a man of the world. The church had wept with him. People had reached over the pews to squeeze Caleb's shoulder and tell him how lucky he was to have a friend like Grant. Caleb had believed it too. That was the part he would have to sit with. For 14 months, he had let a grief so heavy he could barely lift his own arms in the morning stand between him and a single hard question. And the question was the one his 10-year-old had just asked at the kitchen table without even knowing it was a weapon. In April, his mother could not hold a spoon. So whose hand had signed her name? He looked at his son, who was watching him the way children watch a parent's face to learn whether the world is still safe. He did not lie to the boy, because Hannah had made him promise once, never to lie to Wyatt about anything that mattered, that a child could survive almost any true thing and almost no false one. "I don't know how she signed it," Caleb said, "but you're right that she couldn't have, and we're going to find out who did." That night after Wyatt was asleep, Caleb walked out to the hives in the dark with a red lamp, the way he did when he could not sleep. And he stood among the boxes with their painted names, Birdie and Junebug and Sweet Clover and the rest, 16 small houses on a street his wife had lettered by hand, and he thought about smoke. You cannot rob a hive that knows you're robbing it. 20,000 bees will defend what is theirs to the death, so you do not fight them. You calm them. You send cool smoke into the box, and the smoke tells the old alarm in them that there is a fire somewhere and they should fill their bellies with honey and prepare to flee. And while they are quiet and heavy and turned inward with worry, you lift the lid and take the year's work right out from over their heads, and they let you because they are too busy being afraid to notice the hand. Grief, he understood now, standing in the dark, was just a slower kind of smoke, and someone had known exactly how to use it. He did not sleep. In the morning, he did the only thing he knew how to do with the problem, which was to go and look at it up close and refuse to look away. He called the number on the letter and sat on hold for an hour and finally reached a claims department, and he asked them to send him a copy of the beneficiary change form that his late wife had supposedly signed. The woman on the line told him he was not the beneficiary and had no right to the file. He said the beneficiary was his best friend and the insured was his wife, and the boy she left behind was 10 years old and sleeping down the hall, and something in how he said it, flat and slow and without any heat at all, made the woman go quiet and then say she would mail him what she was allowed to mail, which was a redacted copy, because the policy was contested adjacent, whatever that meant. It came 4 days later, and the form was where the grief stopped looking like grief and started looking like a plan. The signature at the bottom was Hannah's name. It was even close enough that a stranger would nod. But Caleb had 11 years of his wife's handwriting on the sides of 16 hives 50 yards from his back door, and he had watched her sign her name 10,000 times, and he knew the way she looped the H and dropped the tail of the Y. And this was a careful copy, made by a hand that had studied hers, but had never been hers. More than that, there was the date. The form was dated the 9th of April. And Caleb knew, the way you know the day your life broke in half, that by the 9th of April, his wife had been 3 weeks past the last time she held anything at all. He did not trust the feeling in his chest, because grief makes a man see betrayal in the mail and the weather, so he did the thing he did trust, which was to go and compare. He carried the form out to the field in the last light and walked down the row of hives to number 4, the one Hannah had lettered, Sweet Clover, the summer Wyatt was born, and he held the paper up beside her painted letters. He was not a handwriting man, but he had spent 11 years reading the particular way his wife closed a loop. The small lift she put at the start of an H, like a person taking a breath before a word. The way her letters leaned into one another like people at a crowded table. The name on the form had all the parts and none of the breath. It was her signature the way a wax cell is a flower, the right shape built by something that had studied the real thing and could never be it. Somebody had practiced her. Somebody had sat with her name until they could make it, and then put a date on it the calendar would not allow, and the two things together were not grief anymore. They were a hand. He drove into town to the one place he thought might still have proof of that, which was the hospice, where Hannah had spent her final month. A low brick building behind the Baptist church with a garden nobody weeded. He did not have an appointment. He stood at the front desk in his canvas jacket and asked whether there was any record of when his wife had lost the use of her hands. And the day nurse looked at him with the particular pity people saved for a widower who has clearly come unmoored, and told him gently that they could not share medical records with a walk-in, that these things were private, that he should go home and rest. He was turning to leave when a young man pushing a laundry cart stopped in the hallway and said, "You're Hannah's husband," from the bees. The young man was named Dominic Hale, and he was 26, and he worked the overnight shift, and he was the kind of person the world is built to walk past. He emptied bins and changed sheets and sat with the dying at 3 in the morning when their families had gone home to sleep, and nobody at that hospice, or in that town, had ever once thought to ask Dominic Hale what he knew, because it did not occur to them that a night aide knew anything. But Dominic Hale had sat with Hannah Dorsey on a dozen of her last nights. He remembered that she liked the window cracked even in the cold. He remembered that she talked about the bees. And he remembered, because he was the one who wrote it in the shift log at the end of every night, exactly when her hands had gone. "She couldn't hold the call button by the middle of March," Dominic said, quiet, glancing down the hall. "We moved it to a pad by her cheek. It's in the notes. Every shift we write what the patient can and can't do. It's how the next shift knows." He looked at Caleb. "Why are you asking me that a year later?" Caleb told him. He told him about the letter and the name and the 9th of April, and he watched the young man's face change. And Dominic Hale, who had spent his whole working life being invisible, said the thing that turned a grieving man into an investigator. "Mr. Dorsey," he said, "in April there was no way on this earth she signed anything. But I'll tell you something else, because it's been bothering me for a year and I never had anybody to tell." He lowered his voice further. "That man, the one who spoke at her funeral, the insurance man, everybody said what a good friend he was. He never came. Not once on my shift, not the last 6 weeks. I know because I logged every visitor, every night, name and time. It's how we know who to call. And his name is not in that book one single time." He shook his head. "But he stood up in that church and said she held his hand at the end and gave him her last wishes. I was there. I went on my day off, and I sat in the back thinking, when? When did she hold your hand? Because I was in that room every night and you were not. There it was. The whole shape of it, handed to Caleb in a hallway by the one man nobody had thought to ask. Grant had not been there. And a man who was not there could not have taken a dying woman's hand and heard her last wishes, and a man who was not there could not have watched her sign a form, because there had been no signing and no wishes and no hand held at all. The eulogy and the signature were the same lie told twice, and they were built out of the same missing thing. Grant Merrow's alibi for stealing $500,000 was a tender story about a bedside he had never once stood beside. For 3 days after that hallway, Caleb did the hardest work of his life, which was nothing. He knew, and he could not show that he knew, because a hive you have decided to move is a hive you must not alarm. On the Saturday, he stood at his market table with his jars in rows, and Grant Merrow came down the aisle in a golf shirt with his big weekend laugh, and stopped and bought 2 jars of the wildflower, and told the woman beside him that Caleb here made the best honey in 3 counties and had the biggest heart in the state. He clapped Caleb on the shoulder and asked after Wyatt. And Caleb smiled and thanked him and made his change and asked after the fund and let him walk away down the aisle shaking hands, because the whole plan now depended on Grant Merrow believing for a few more weeks that the beekeeper was exactly as simple and as beaten as the story said. It was harder than the funeral, to put honey in a thief's hands and thank him for the kind word. His own hands did not shake. He had spent 20 years learning to keep them still around things that could sting, and now he learned the last of it, that the stillest hand of all is the one that already knows where the knife is and only waits for the right light to show the room. If someone you love once stood at a microphone and performed their grief so beautifully that the whole room turned to look at them instead of at the coffin, hold on to this story, because what undoes a man like that in the end is never the thing he faked. It is the room he swore he was in. Caleb went home with 2 facts now instead of 1, and they were heavier together than apart. And he understood that he was out past the edge of what he knew how to do. He was a man who could read a hive and could not read a courtroom. He needed someone who spoke the other language. He could not afford a lawyer, so he did what the letter had told him not to do, and what turned out to be the smartest thing he did in the whole business. On the back of the redacted form there was a stamp, a fraud reporting line for the Kentucky Department of Insurance, and Caleb called it expecting nothing, expecting a machine. He got a man named Harlan Voss. Voss was 58 and 11 months from a pension he had stopped believing in, and he had spent 30 years watching insurance fraud go unpunished because the victims were always tired and the perpetrators always had good coats and good lawyers, and he had grown a thick gray shell of not caring that he wore like the canvas jacket Caleb wore, for the same reason, to keep the weather off. He almost took Caleb's call the way he took all the others, which was to log it and shelve it. But Caleb, who did not know how to be dramatic, simply laid the 2 facts down side by side in his flat, slow voice, the signature dated 3 weeks after the hands had failed, and the friend who eulogized a bedside he had never visited, and something in Harlan Voss that he had thought was long dead sat up and paid attention. "Mr. Dorsey," Voss said, "do you know what the single hardest thing to prove in my whole line of work is? Intent. A forged signature. A lawyer will tell you the 6 sign's shaky. Dates get transposed. It's a clerical mess. Who can say? It walks 9 times out of 10. He paused. "But you just handed me a man who stood up in a church and described out loud, in detail, a conversation that the records will show could not have happened. That's not a shaky signature. That's a man telling me on tape that he was somewhere he was not. Was that eulogy recorded?" It had been. The church live-streamed its services, and the funeral was still sitting on the church's video page 14 months later, where anyone could watch Grant Merrow weep and describe the last wishes of a woman he had not visited in 6 weeks. Harlan Voss watched it that night in his kitchen and did not sleep either. And in the morning he opened a file, and the file grew teeth Caleb had not known it could grow. Because Harlan Voss did what an investigator does that a grieving beekeeper cannot, which is to pull the thread sideways. He ran Grant Merrow's name against every policy the man had written and every claim that had paid out in the county over the last 6 years, and a pattern rose up out of the water all at once, cold and undeniable. Grant Merrow had been the agent of a record on the life policies of 3 other people who had died in that county in the last 4 years. An elderly widow he took to church every Sunday, a retired man from his congregation with no close family, a woman from the next town whose grown children lived far away, 3 deaths, 3 policies, and in all 3, sometime in the final months, the beneficiary had quietly changed. Not always to Grant himself. He was not that careless. 2 of them named a small charity, the Ambrose Community Blessing Trust, that turned out on paper to have exactly 1 signer with control of its account, and that signer was Grant Merrow. And in all 3, Grant Merrow had given the eulogy. That was the tell. And it was the thing that finally made Harlan Voss's old hands shake a little as he laid the pages out. Other men hid. This one performed. The eulogy was not a mask he wore in spite of the theft. It was part of the machine. It cemented him in the town's memory as the devoted friend, the one the dead had trusted, so that if anyone ever asked a question, the whole community would answer it for him before he had to open his mouth. He had built himself a reputation for loving people at the exact moment he was robbing them, and he had done it 4 times, and he had gotten better at it each time. And Hannah Dorsey, whose husband kept bees and whose son fed her ice chips, had been the biggest payout yet. The why came last, and it was smaller and sadder than his victims deserved. Voss's subpoenas pried open the Ambrose Community Blessing Trust, and behind it, behind Grant Merrow's big laugh and his good coat, was a hole. He had been managing money for half the county, and years ago he had started borrowing from the accounts he managed to cover his own bad bets, a little at first and then a landslide. And by the time Hannah got sick, he was better than $600,000 underwater in other people's retirements, and the whole thing was 3 audits away from swallowing him. He was not a mastermind. He was a drowning man who had discovered that the dying could be robbed politely, and that a town would thank you for it if you cried at the right time. There was one more thing, and Caleb was the only one who understood it, because Caleb had known him since they were 7. Somewhere under the debt was the older, uglier thing that had always been there, the thing Caleb had felt his whole life and forgiven every time. Grant had spent 40 years standing in the warm part of the room and had never once had what Caleb had, a wife who painted his name on a beehive, a son who would feed him ice. He had watched Caleb's plain, small, real life from across a lifetime and told himself it should have been his. Taking the $500,000 was theft. Taking the eulogy, taking her last wishes, taking the memory of her final hours and putting himself inside it where the husband should have been. That was the envy finally getting its hands on the thing it could never grow itself. There was one more thing, and it did not come from a subpoena. It came from a shoebox on the top shelf of a closet Caleb had not been able to open in a year. Hannah had been the one who kept papers, and one night Caleb made himself take the box down, and under the marriage certificate and the boy's baptism card was a will. A plain one from a legal aid clinic 2 towns over, signed and witnessed and dated the winter she was diagnosed, months before her hands failed, when she still wrote in her own strong hand. It left everything to Caleb, and named Caleb the guardian of anything held for Wyatt, and it said, in a clause someone at the clinic must have suggested, that she revoked any beneficiary designation that did not match her wishes. She had done it right. She had done it early, clear-eyed, in her own real handwriting, while she still could. Grant had not forged a document into an empty space. He had forged one over the top of a woman who had already, carefully, quietly made sure her husband and her son were safe. He had bet that a grieving beekeeper would never open the shoebox. For 14 months, he had been right. Grant had not spent the $500,000 quietly. That would have been the safe thing, and safety was never his weakness. He had used a chunk of it to launch, with great public fanfare, the Hannah Dorsey Memorial Fund, a scholarship for local children in the name of the woman whose money he had stolen and whose husband he was erasing. And he had made himself its chairman, and there was to be a gala, a catered evening at the county event hall, at which the town would gather to honor Grant Merrow's generosity and the memory of dear Hannah. It was in 9 days. The invitation had come to Caleb's own mailbox, addressed to the grieving widower, inviting him to come and watch his best friend be celebrated for his wife's stolen money in his wife's stolen name. Voss wanted to do it quietly, a grand jury, a sealed indictment, and arrest some gray Tuesday morning. It was the correct way and it was the safe way, and Caleb told him no, not out of anger, though the anger was there, low and banked like coals under ash. He said no because of the town. For 14 months, the town had believed a story in which Caleb Dorsey was a broken, simple man, and Grant Merrow was the friend who carried him, and if Grant were quietly arrested, that story would survive it, would harden into the last thing Wyatt's town ever believed about his mother's death, that the beekeeper's grief had curdled into some ugly accusation against a good man. The lie had been told in a church out loud to everyone. It had to be undone the same way, in the open, in front of the same faces, or it would never be undone at all. There was a danger to that, and Voss made him look at it squarely before he agreed. Grant Merrow was not a cartoon. He was a drowning man in the last weeks before the water closed, and a drowning man will pull down whoever is nearest. And Caleb had already seen what the nearest thing was, because Grant had reached for it once already. 2 nights after the letter came, before Caleb had told a soul, Grant had appeared at the farmhouse door with a bakery box and that big, warm voice, as if nothing on earth were wrong, and he had sat at the same kitchen table where Wyatt had read the letter and he had made his offer. I heard Ashford sent you some paperwork, Grant had said, easy as weather. I should have walked you through it a long time ago, and that's on me. Hannah set it up so the money would come to me and I'd steward it for Wyatt's future, because she didn't want you to have to think about tax and trusts and all that while you were grieving. It's all for the boy, Caleb. The scholarship, the fund, all of it. It's her legacy. He had reached across and put his hand on Caleb's shoulder, the same gesture from the back room of 100 memories. You don't want to go stirring this up. You're a good man, but you're not a well man right now. Everybody can see it, out there alone with those bees. A judge takes one look at a widower making wild claims against the trustee his own wife chose. No money, no lawyer, a 10-year-old in the house. And that judge starts to wonder if the boy wouldn't be better off somewhere steadier. I'd hate that. I'd take Wyatt in a heartbeat, you know I would, but I'd hate for it to come to that. Let it lie. Let me do right by her the way she wanted. He had said it kindly. He had said it while breaking a pastry in half. And Caleb had understood, sitting there, that this was the smoke, that this was the exact thing the man did, that he was being told to fill his belly with fear and turn inward and stay quiet while the hand came down over his head, and that the hand this time was reaching not for honey but for his son. He had walked Grant to the door. He had not raised his voice because Wyatt was asleep, and because a man who keeps bees learns that the calm hand is the one that lives. But at the door, he had said one thing. Hannah painted your name on a hive once. Did you know that? Years ago. Hive number 9. She said you were family. He had looked at his oldest friend. I scraped it off this morning. Grant had not answered, and Caleb had shut the door, and he had known then that there was no arrangement, and no scholarship, and no stewardship he could ever accept, because a man who would use your grieving son as a chip to keep you quiet has already told you everything true about himself, and the only choice left was whether to be brave in the open or silent in the dark. That night Wyatt came into the front room in his socks, the way he did when sleep would not take him, and he stood in the doorway and said he had heard some of it. He asked in the flat, brave way he had gotten from his mother whether he was going to have to go live with Uncle Grant. Caleb put down what he was holding and got level with him. He told his son the truth because he had promised her he always would. He said that some grown men, when they do a wrong thing, try to make it look like the person they wronged is the one who is broken, and that Grant was going to say Caleb was not a good enough father, and that it would be ugly for a while and loud, and that people they knew might believe it for a time. And then he said the other true thing. He said that Wyatt's mother had written down, in her own hand, while she still could, exactly where she wanted her son to be, and that where she wanted him was here, in this house, with his father and the bees, and that no smooth man at any microphone could sign his way over the top of a mother who had made her wishes plain. He asked the boy if he understood. Wyatt thought about it in his careful way and said she'd have painted it on a hive. Caleb had to look at the window for a moment before he could answer. Yeah, he said, she would have. He chose the open, and he chose the gala. It was the correct venue for a reason Voss came to appreciate. The Hannah Dorsey Memorial Fund Gala would put Grant Merrow at a microphone in front of the whole town, in the posture he could not resist, the devoted friend performing his devotion. He would not be able to help himself. He would talk about her. And the plan was built on the one thing about Grant that had never once failed in 40 years, which was that he would always reach for the eulogy. So they built it small and exact, the way you build anything that has to survive a crowd. Voss would be there with a colleague from the state and a county deputy, standing quiet along the wall, because an arrest in a full room is a thing you plan like a controlled burn, or you do not do at all. Dominic would bring the original log, the real-bound book, and not a copy, so that no lawyer could later call it a printout somebody had typed up after the fact. Pearl Gaddis, the head nurse, would come because she had loved Hannah and because she could swear to the nursing record under her own name. And Caleb would carry 3 pages and the church's own video and would say as little as a man could say, because Voss had taught him that in a room like that, the facts are loudest when the person reading them is quiet. Everything hung on a single bet, and the bet was not on evidence. It was on character. It was that Grant Merrow, handed a microphone in a room that loved him, would not be able to keep himself from telling the story one more time. If he only thanked the crowd and sat down, the trap held nothing. They were wagering the whole night on a man's need to be adored, and the only soul alive who could promise that the need would win was the one who had grown up beside it. Though the event hall was full the night it happened. The county's Sunday best out in force. Ministers and merchants and the Little League parents, tables with white cloths and a slideshow of Hannah's face cycling on the wall, her market smile, her hand on a jar of honey, and it turned Caleb's stomach to see her used as wallpaper for the thing that had eaten her. Dominic Hale came in his one good shirt and sat in the back, twisting his hands. Harlan Voss stood along the side wall with two people nobody there recognized, a woman from the state and a man in a county sheriff's jacket, and waited. And Grant Merrow worked the room in a beautiful gray suit, warm and enormous and beloved, squeezing shoulders. And when he saw Caleb come in, he crossed the whole room to embrace him in front of everyone and murmured into his ear, still smiling for the crowd, "I'm glad you came. This is the right thing. She'd be proud of both of us." Then Grant took the stage, and the room hushed, and he began to do the thing he did. He talked about Hannah. He talked about her laugh and her honey and her boy. And then, because he could not help it, because the applause of a room was the only food he had ever really eaten, he told them again the story that was the whole foundation of his life now. How in her final days, his dear friend Hannah had held his hand and asked him, with the last of her strength, to look after everything, to protect her son's future, because she trusted him. His voice broke on it. The room made the soft sound a room makes. And at the back, Caleb Dorsey stood up. He did not shout. He had asked the fund's own volunteer, a nervous teenager running the slideshow laptop, for 2 minutes and a chance to say a word about his late wife, and who refuses the widower 2 minutes at the memorial for his own wife. He walked to the front with a plain folder, and he stepped up beside Grant at the microphone, and he said, "I'd like to thank Grant for his beautiful words. I want to show you all something my wife made." And he nodded to the frightened teenager. And the slideshow of Hannah's face went dark, and in its place, on the big wall where the whole town could see it, began to play the church's own recording of Grant Merrow's eulogy from 14 months before. There was Grant on the wall, weeping, saying she took my hand in those final days and gave me her wishes. Caleb let it play for a moment. Then he raised his own hand, and the teenager paused it, and Grant Merrow's tear-streaked face hung frozen and enormous on the wall above the room. "That was April and May of last year," Caleb said to the room in his flat, slow field voice. "He says she took his hand at the end. I want to read you 3 things, and then I'll sit down." He opened the folder. "This is the visitor log from the hospice where my wife spent her last 6 weeks. Every name, every night. It was kept by a young man named Dominic Hale, who sat with her when the rest of us couldn't. Grant's name is not in it. Not once. Not one night in 6 weeks." He set the page on the podium. "This is the nursing record. It says my wife lost the use of her hands in the middle of March. She could not hold a spoon. My son fed her ice off a plastic spoon because her fingers were too cold to close. That is in the record, in the nurse's own writing, dated." He set it down. "And this is the form the insurance company has that gave my wife's $500,000 to the man on that wall. It is signed in my wife's name, and it is dated the 9th of April. He looked up, and for the first time he looked at Grant. 3 weeks after her hand stopped working. From a bedside, this record says he never once stood beside. He let the silence do its work, and it was a very long silence in a very full room. He didn't just take the money. He stood in a church and put himself inside the last hours of her life, hours he wasn't there for, so that all of you would guard the door for him. And it worked for 14 months. It's the same lie twice. He wasn't there to hear her wishes, and he wasn't there to watch her sign, because there were no wishes and there was no signing. There was just my wife and my son and a spoon full of ice. The room did not erupt. It did something worse for Grant, which was that it went completely still. 400 people recalculating 14 months of belief at the same time. And in that stillness, the coldest sound in the world was Harlan Voss stepping off the sidewall with 2 quiet people behind him. Grant Merrow was a drowning man, and drowning men pull down. He grabbed the microphone and his warm voice came apart at the edges, and he said it was a lie, that Caleb was sick, that everyone knew Caleb had never been right since Hannah passed, out there alone with those bees, that this was a grieving man's delusion, and they should feel sorry for him, not listen to him. Consider the source, a simple man who couldn't read a policy if his life depended on it. And for one breath, it almost worked, because a room does not want to stop loving a man it has loved for 40 years, and it will reach for any rope. Grant felt the reach and grabbed it. He pointed to the back of the hall, at Dominic Hale in his one good shirt, and his voice found its feet again. "And who is this built on? Some overnight aide with a notebook? A boy who changes bedsheets against a man this town has known its whole life?" Heads turned to look at Dominic, and the young man went pale under all those eyes, because being looked at was the one thing his life had never trained him for. He half rose. He did not have the words. Words had never been his end of the world. But the hospice's head nurse, Pearl Gaddis, who had run that floor for 20 years and had come tonight only because she had loved Hannah, stood up 3 tables over. "I keep those logs, Grant," she said. "I sign off on every page myself. That boy wrote down the truth every single night, which is more than you did from that pulpit." And the rope the room had reached for went slack in its hands. And Caleb Dorsey looked at his oldest friend across a microphone, and he did the one thing that could not be answered. He did not raise his voice. "You're right that I couldn't read the policy, Grant," he said. "You always were the one who could talk. That's the whole thing you built this on since we were 7 years old. That I'm slow and you're smooth, and nobody would ever check behind you." He nodded slowly. "So I got somebody to help me read. It took 3 weeks. And the first thing I read all the way to the bottom was you." There was nowhere for Grant to put that. He had built every wall he owned on being loved by a room. And the room was looking at him now the way you look at a hive when you finally see the rot under the honey, and the 2 quiet people had reached the stage. What happened after that happened the way these things happen, slower and more clerical than the movies. A hand on an elbow, a reading of rights under the frozen weeping face on the wall, a beautiful gray suit walking out between 2 people who did not care that it was beautiful. The cost came due in the weeks after, because a lie undone in public does not clean up gently. Grant Marrow was charged, and not with one thing, but with a pattern of them. And the eulogies were the spine of the case, 4 of them, because Harlan Voss stood in front of a grand jury and did the thing Grant's whole method had never accounted for, which was to line the 4 funerals up in a row and show that every single time this man described holding a dying person's hand, the record showed he had not been in the room. His performance, the thing that had protected him 4 times, became the map that convicted him, because a man who lies the same beautiful way every time has left the same fingerprint every time. He tried at first the way men like him do, to have his lawyers carve him out, to blame a clerical error, to settle the Dorsey matter quietly and make the rest disappear. What sank him was the thing that had built him. He had needed to be adored too much to hide. There were 4 recordings of him describing 4 bedsides he had never visited, and you cannot cross-examine your own weeping face on a church's video page saying words the calendar says were impossible. He took a plea rather than let a jury watch all 4 eulogies played back to back. The Ambrose Community Blessing Trust was unwound, and the 3 other families got letters, and the woman whose grown children lived far away had those children fly home, finally, to sit with a caseworker and understand what had been done to their mother while they were away. The scholarship did not die, which surprised people. The court could have dissolved the whole fund into restitution, but the judge, at the family's request, kept the Hannah Dorsey Memorial Fund alive and put it under a new board of people who had actually known her, the head nurse among them, and it went on giving small checks to local children the way it had always claimed to, except that now the name on it meant what it said. Caleb sat on that board. He did not say much at the meetings. He mostly listened, the way he listened to a hive, and once a year at the market he set out a table of honey and gave the whole day's take to it, in her name, in his own hand on the jar labels, because there are 2 ways a dead woman's name can be used, and he had decided his son would grow up seeing the right one. The $500,000 came back. The court voided the beneficiary change as a forgery procured by fraud, and the money went where it had always been meant to go, into a real trust for Wyatt, with his father as the guardian of it, the arrangement Hannah had actually made in the actual will and that Grant had quietly hoped no one would ever bother to read against the form. Dominic Hale testified in daylight in a collared shirt and told a courtroom everything he had written in a shift log at 3 in the morning while the town slept. And when it was over, the prosecutor shook his hand and called him the most important witness in the case. And Dominic looked like a man who had never once been called important in his life, because he had not. Harlan Voss got his conviction 11 months before his pension, and he did not retire after all. He told Caleb he had remembered, in the middle of it, what the job had been for. The town had to sit with what it had done, which is a harder thing than being lied to. These were not bad people. They were people who had wept at the right cues for a man who knew exactly which cues to pull, who had squeezed a grieving beekeeper's shoulder and told him how lucky he was, who had guarded the door for a thief because the thief cried so well. Some of them could not look at Caleb afterward, out of shame, and some of them looked at him too much and stopped him at the market to say they had always known there was more to him, and he took that the way he took all of it, quietly, without correction, because a man who works bees knows there is no profit in being right out loud. What mattered had not happened at a gala or in a church. It had happened at a kitchen table over a letter when a 10-year-old asked the one question the whole town had been too comforted to ask. On a Saturday that fall, Caleb took Wyatt out to the hives in the good gold light of the afternoon. The bees were bringing in the last of the goldenrod, and the field smelled the way it smelled every year at that time, of honey and dust and cooling grass, the smell that meant the work of the season was safe in the boxes and the winter could come. Hive number 9 still had a pale scar on its side where a name had been scraped off. Caleb had not repainted it. He handed his son a small brush and a little pot of the same white paint Hannah had always used. And he showed him how she had held it, and where she had started her letters, and he stood with his scarred hands over his boy's small ones, the way you steady anything that is doing something for the first time. Together, slowly, one careful letter at a time, they painted a name back onto the side of hive number 9, not Grant's, hers. Hannah, in a 10-year-old's best imitation of his mother's own careful hand, a little crooked, pressing hard, made by fingers that were warm and worked and were not going anywhere. Wyatt stepped back and looked at it. "It's not as good as hers," he said. "No," Caleb said, "but it's yours, and it's real. Anybody wants to know whose these bees are, whose this place is, whose you are, that's where they look now. Not on some form in a filing cabinet. Here, on the box, in our own hand." The boy put his finger near the wet letters, not touching, the way you hover near a thing you love and don't want to smudge. And out in the field, the 16 hives hummed the low even hum they hummed when all was well. 20,000 bees to a box, each one no bigger than a knuckle, each one nothing on its own, the whole colony together strong enough to keep out anything on earth that came for what was theirs. You calm a hive with smoke before you rob it, because a frightened bee will not sting the hand that keeps it quiet. Grief works the same way, and Grant Marrow had known it, and he had walked into 4 families at the exact hour the smoke was thickest and lifted the lid and taken the year's work right out over their heads, and every time the town had thanked him for the smell of smoke. But smoke wears off. It always wears off. And what he never understood, standing in the warm part of the room his whole life, performing a love he had to steal because he could not grow it, was that the smallest member of the colony, the one nobody thinks to ask, the night aide, the boy with the spoon, the quiet man in the canvas jacket, remembers, and a hive that finally wakes up will defend what is its own to the last small body in the box. So watch who was loudest at the funeral. Then watch who was in the room when it was quiet, when there was nothing to be gained, when the hands had gone cold and all that was left to do was hold them. Those are rarely the same person. And if you ever have to know for certain which one loved the one you lost, do not ask the man at the microphone. Ask the child who fed them ice. Ask the aide who logged the empty chair. Ask the small, overlooked people who were actually there. They kept the record. They always keep the record. And send this to the one who sat in the quiet room with you and tell them you saw them there.